At 2:17 on the afternoon of March 3, 1978, Robert Chen stood in the attic of his childhood home in San Francisco, staring at a steamer trunk he'd passed 1,000 times without opening. 41 years old, 2 children, in college, 0 reasons to believe his family's past contained anything the world didn't already know. The trunk had belonged to his grandfather. He'd died 3 months earlier. The funeral had been quiet, 12 people, a Buddhist ceremony Robert's children didn't understand. Ashes scattered in the bay, according to his wishes. Now, sorting through his grandfather's belongings before the house was sold, Robert had found the trunk pushed against the far wall of the attic, buried beneath old newspapers and boxes of his father's books. It was locked. He'd found the key in his grandfather's desk drawer, wrapped in a handkerchief that smelled faintly of tobacco and old ink. The key was brass, small, worn smooth by decades of handling. Robert had avoided opening the trunk for 3 days. Something about the way his grandfather had kept it locked, the way he'd never mentioned it in all the years Robert had known him, made him hesitate. But the house needed to be emptied. The real estate agent was coming Monday. Some decisions couldn't wait. He turned the key. The lock clicked open with a sound that felt too loud in the silent attic. The trunk exhaled dust and time. Robert coughed, waved his hand through the haze, and looked inside. Photographs first, sepia-toned, edges brittle. His grandfather as a young man, maybe 25, standing in front of a railroad construction site, mountains in the background, dozens of Chinese workers visible behind him, all wearing the same rough work clothes. Then letters, hundreds of them, bundled with twine that disintegrated when he touched it, all handwritten in Chinese characters Robert couldn't read. Robert spoke Cantonese, his grandfather had insisted, but he'd never learned to read traditional Chinese script. These letters were written in a hand so careful, so precise, that even without understanding the words, he could feel the importance behind them. He set the letters aside carefully. Beneath them, were wrapped in oilcloth, were documents, official-looking papers printed on heavy stock, some in English, some in Chinese. Robert unfolded one carefully. It was a contract, dated 1867, between the Central Pacific Railroad Company and, he squinted at the faded ink, his grandfather's father, his great-grandfather, a name he'd never heard spoken in his family. The contract specified work terms, payment rates, living conditions. Robert read slowly, his hands beginning to shake. His great-grandfather had been a labor contractor for the Transcontinental Railroad. Not just a worker, a contractor, someone who had negotiated terms, managed crews, handled payments for hundreds of Chinese laborers during the construction through the Sierra Nevada. Robert had grown up hearing vague stories about family members who'd worked on the railroad. Everyone in Chinatown knew about the Chinese contribution to building the transcontinental line, but his family had never claimed any special role. His grandfather had worked in a laundry. His father owned a small grocery. Working-class people, invisible in the history books. But these documents told a different story. Robert spent the next hour carefully removing everything from the trunk. More contracts, ledgers showing payment records for workers, letters of correspondence between his great-grandfather and railroad executives, a journal written in Chinese, and at the very bottom was wrapped in silk that had faded to a dusty gray, a photograph Robert had never seen before. 27 Chinese men standing on a completed section of railroad track, mountains rising behind them, snow visible on distant peaks. The men stood in 2 rows, formal and proud, despite their worn work clothes. His great-grandfather stood in the center of the front row. He held a piece of paper in his hands. Robert turned the photograph over, written in English on the back, in careful block letters. Summit Tunnel Crew, February 1867. This tunnel killed 11 men. We finished it anyway. Robert sat down on an old chair. The photograph felt heavy in his hands, heavier than paper should be. Summit Tunnel. He knew that name. It had been one of the most dangerous sections of the Transcontinental Railroad. 15 tunnels blasted through solid granite in the Sierra Nevada. Chinese workers had done most of the work, drilling by hand, using black powder and nitroglycerin, working through winters that buried the construction sites under 40 feet of snow. History books mentioned it briefly. Chinese labor, dangerous conditions, many deaths. But no names, no faces, no documents showing who these men were, how they organized their work, what they thought about what they were building. Robert's hands were shaking now. He set the photograph down carefully and reached for the journal. It was his great-grandfather's handwriting, the same careful script from the letters. The journal covered 3 years, from 1866 to 1869. Robert couldn't read most of it, but scattered throughout were passages in English. Apparently his great-grandfather had been learning the language and practicing by writing translations of his own thoughts. One passage, dated January 1867, was in clear English. "We work through winter. Americans say Chinese cannot work in snow. We prove them wrong. Yesterday we lost 2 men. Avalanche. Today we work again. What choice? We came to Gold Mountain for our families. We stay for same reason. Mr. Strobridge says we do the work Americans won't. This is true. But we do it better." Robert sat in that attic for 3 hours, carefully sorting through the trunk's contents. The afternoon light faded. The house grew cold. He barely noticed. By the time he finished, he'd assembled a collection of documents that told a story he'd never heard before. His great-grandfather hadn't just been a worker. He'd been a foreman, a translator, a negotiator between the railroad company and the Chinese labor crews. He'd kept meticulous records of wages paid, work completed, men injured, men killed. The ledgers showed that Chinese workers were paid less than white workers for the same work. But they also showed that Chinese crews consistently completed more work per day than any other group. The numbers were undeniable. The letters, Robert would need someone to translate them fully, appeared to be correspondence with families back in China, with other labor contractors, with Chinese merchants in San Francisco who helped recruit workers. This wasn't just family history, this was American history that had been hidden in an attic for over a century. Robert spent the weekend trying to read as much as he could. He called his sister in Los Angeles. She drove up Sunday morning. They sat together in the attic, going through the documents page by page. His sister had studied Chinese literature in college. She could read the traditional characters their grandfather had written. The letters were even more remarkable than Robert had imagined. One letter, written in 1868 to his great-grandfather's brother in China, described the completion of Summit Tunnel. "Brother, today we broke through. For 18 months we have drilled through this mountain. The Americans thought it would take 3 years. We finished in less than 2. They paid us $2 per day. White workers received $3 for easier work. But we have proven what Chinese labor can accomplish. When this railroad is complete, America will be connected ocean to ocean, and Chinese hands will have built the hardest sections. Perhaps someday our children will remember this." Robert's sister looked up from the letter, tears in her eyes. He knew they wouldn't be remembered. He wrote this so we would know. The implications were staggering. For over a century, historians had written about the Transcontinental Railroad with only scattered mentions of Chinese labor, a few paragraphs in textbooks, acknowledgement that Chinese workers had been involved. But no primary sources, no documents from the workers themselves, no voices, no faces, no names. Except now there were. Robert called the California Historical Society on Monday morning. The archivist he spoke with was skeptical at first. People claimed to have important historical documents all the time. Most turned out to be ordinary family papers, interesting to descendants but not significant to scholarship. But when Robert described what he'd found, labor contracts, work ledgers, personal correspondence, photographs with names and dates, the archivist's tone changed. "Don't touch anything else," she said. "We're sending someone to look at these documents today." Two historians arrived that afternoon, a professor from UC Berkeley specializing in Asian American history and a document specialist from the California State Archives. They spent 4 hours in Robert's attic, examining the trunk's contents with white gloves and careful reverence. The professor looked up after reading through the first bundle of letters. "Do you understand what you have here?" Robert shook his head. "This is the most complete first-hand account of Chinese railroad labor we've ever found. The photographs alone, we have maybe 3 photographs of Chinese railroad workers from this period. You have 27, with names." The document specialist was examining the work ledgers. These payment records document systemic wage discrimination. We've always known it happened, but we've never had the actual ledgers. This is evidence, legal evidence, if anyone had wanted to prosecute at the time, which, of course, no one did. They asked if Robert would consider donating the collection to the California State Archives. Not immediately, but eventually. These documents needed to be preserved, digitized, made available to researchers. Robert said yes without hesitation. This wasn't just his family's story anymore, it was everyone's story. The news broke 3 weeks later. The San Francisco Chronicle ran a front-page story. "Lost Voices Found. Chinese Railroad Worker Documents Discovered in SF Attic." The article included one of the photographs from the trunk. 27 Chinese men standing on finished railroad track, mountains behind them. The caption listed each man's name, translated from his great-grandfather's careful notes. Within days, descendants of other Chinese railroad workers began contacting the Historical Society. They'd heard the story. They wondered if their family's papers might be important too. One woman brought in her grandfather's diary. Another man had photographs. A third family had a collection of letters similar to Robert's great-grandfather's. For generations, Chinese-American families had kept these documents in trunks and boxes, in attics and basements, never realizing that what they had preserved was evidence of a history that textbooks had erased. The California Historical Society organized an exhibition, "The Railroad Builders: Chinese Labor and the Transcontinental Railroad." It opened in September 1979. Robert attended the opening with his sister, his children, his elderly mother, who'd never known these documents existed. They stood in front of a display case containing his great-grandfather's journal, open to the passage about Summit Cunnel. Next to it was the photograph of the 27 workers. A placard explained, "For over a century, the contributions of Chinese laborers to the Transcontinental Railroad were acknowledged but rarely documented. These workers were paid less, worked in the most dangerous conditions, and completed some of the most difficult sections of the entire line. Yet their names, their voices, and their own accounts of this work were absent from the historical record, until now." Robert's mother stood in front of the display for a long time, reading her grandfather's words. She'd never learned to read Chinese. Robert's sister quietly translated for her. When they finished, his mother said, "He wrote this so we would remember." And we forgot. For all these years, we forgot. Robert put his hand on her shoulder. "But now we remember." The exhibition traveled to 6 cities over the next 2 years. Museums in Chicago, New York, and Washington requested copies of the documents for their own collections. Textbook publishers began including excerpts from the letters in new editions of American history books. Graduate students wrote dissertations analyzing the work ledgers, the wage discrimination, the labor organization strategies Robert's great-grandfather had documented. The photographs were reprinted in scholarly journals, in popular magazines, in newspapers. The faces of those 27 men, faces that had been hidden in an attic for over a century, became icons of a history that had almost been lost. But for Robert, the most meaningful moment came 2 years after he'd opened the trunk. He received a letter from a woman in Sacramento. She'd seen the exhibition. One of the photographs had shown a young man named Chen Wei-sang. She believed this was her great-great-grandfather. She'd heard stories about him working on the railroad, but her family had no photographs, no documents, nothing except oral history that had grown vaguer with each generation. Now she had a photograph. She had his name in her great-great-grandfather's handwriting. She had evidence that he existed, that he'd worked on Summit Tunnel, that he'd been part of something important. She thanked Robert for opening the trunk, for not throwing the contents away when they seemed like old junk, for recognizing that sometimes family histories are also American histories. Robert wrote back. He told her about the moment he'd turned the key, about his hesitation, about the 3 days he'd walked past the locked trunk before finally opening it. He told her that he'd almost thrown everything away, that his first instinct when he saw documents he couldn't read had been to close the trunk and call an estate sale company to haul it all to the dump. He'd hesitated because of his grandfather, because even though the old man had never spoken about what was in the trunk, he'd kept it locked. He'd kept the key. He'd preserved these papers through decades of moving, through poverty, through times when selling antique documents might have helped the family survive. His grandfather had protected this history without ever explaining why. Now, Robert understood. Some stories are too important to tell while you're living them. Some truths are too painful, too complicated, too easily misunderstood by people who weren't there. So you preserve them. You lock them in trunks, you keep the key hidden, and you hope that someday someone will open that trunk and understand what you couldn't say. The Chen family papers, as they came to be known in academic circles, changed how historians wrote about the Transcontinental Railroad, changed how textbooks described Chinese labor, changed how museums presented the construction of the line that connected America coast to coast. But more than that, they changed how families thought about the trunks in their own attics. How many other stories were hidden? How many other voices had been preserved by families who didn't know they were keeping history alive? Robert never sold his grandfather's house. He converted the attic into a small archive, climate-controlled, properly organized. The trunk remained there, empty now, but preserved as a reminder. Sometimes he brought his grandchildren to see it. He'd show them the photographs, now professionally scanned and displayed on the walls. He'd read them passages from their great-great-great-grandfather's journal. He'd tell them, "This trunk sat here for over 100 years. Everyone who walked past it thought it was just old junk, but inside was proof that our family built America, that we mattered, that we were here." And then he'd say the most important part. Never throw away what you don't understand. Never assume that old papers are worthless. History isn't just in books. Sometimes it's in locked trunks in your grandfather's attic, waiting for someone brave enough to turn the key. Robert Chen died in 2003 at the age of 66. He never published a book about his discovery, never sought fame or recognition for what he'd found. But the Chen family papers remain in the California State Archives, digitized, available, studied by researchers from around the world. And on the anniversary of his great-grandfather's death, a date Robert calculated from the journal entries, he would visit the archives. He'd request the journal. He'd sit in the reading room and turn the pages carefully, even though he'd read them dozens of times before. He'd read the entry from May 10, 1869, the day the Transcontinental Railroad was completed at Promontory Summit, Utah. His great-grandfather had written in English that day, "Today the railroad is finished." They drove a golden spike to mark the occasion. No Chinese workers were invited to the ceremony. We watched from a distance. The white men gave speeches about American progress, American ingenuity, American perseverance. They did not mention us. But we were there. And this journal will remember, even if they do not. The entry ended with a single line in Chinese. Robert's sister had translated it years ago. "I was there. We were all there. And someday, someone will know." Robert had turned the key, had opened the trunk, had made sure someone knew. The rest was history, the kind that doesn't erase itself. The kind that waits locked and silent until the right person comes along and decides that the past matters as much as the present. The kind that survives in trunks and attics and in the careful handwriting of men who knew they'd be forgotten unless they wrote their own story down. Some histories are found in libraries. Others wait in locked trunks. Both are real. Both matter. Both survive only because someone refused to throw away what they didn't understand. Robert Chen understood that, and in understanding, he gave back what history had taken away. Names, faces, voices, evidence that 27 Chinese men stood on a mountain in 1867 and built something that lasted longer than any of them lived to see. The trunk is still in the attic, empty now, but preserved. A reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries aren't made by archaeologists or historians. Sometimes they're made by a man in an attic, holding a brass key, deciding whether to open a locked trunk or leave the past buried. Robert opened it, and the past spoke.